All right, thanks everyone for your patience. We had a few technical difficulties up here, but those have been resolved. So I want to call us back to order. We've got a little bit of time allocated this afternoon to get everybody up to speed on where we are on this East Coast Climate Change Scenario Planning Initiative, which many of you in this room have been personally involved in the multiple stages of it. So now we're at the point, well, we have it. What are we going to do with it? And I'm going to turn it over to Tony, and she's going to walk us through sort of an overview of what's happened and some of the possible actions, and lead us, into a point where maybe we can have some questions and some discussions of how we as a commission want to influence this process of moving forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to have my presentation into two parts today. First, I'm going to go over sort of how we got to where we are today in the documents that were in the meeting materials for this, both the summit report and the draft potential action menu. And then in the second half, I will go through the draft potential action menu. Just as a reminder on the objectives of this East Coast Climate Change Scenario Planning Project initiative that has been happening for the last 2 years, we're exploring the East Coast fishery governance and management issues that are being affected by climate-driven changes in fisheries, particularly stock availability and distributions. It's why this process has included all of the fishery management councils on the East Coast, as well as NOAA Fisheries and the science centers, because we want to tackle this problem holistically. And the end goal was to advance a set of tools and processes that can provide flexible and robust fishery management strategies so that we can continue on with this great work that we do as management bodies and providing resilient fisheries and fishing communities, in particular in climate change. And these topics continue to come up in our meetings. It happened this morning in the Coastal Pelagics Board, and it's very clear that we need to be cognizant of these issues and adjusting our management plans as we see changing distributions of our stocks due to climate change and other issues. So we're transitioning into the monitoring phase of this work. And later on in this presentation, I'll go over some new groups that we are establishing to keep this process going, and how each organization will begin to fold some of the potential actions into their annual work plans. We expect to go back over the scenarios as we work through different actions and evaluate processes. This is not intended to be a static process. When you have climate change, you need to constantly be monitoring and seeing how issues are being impacted and how we need to adapt and change our practices over time. And in particular, when we get new information and new data, to reevaluate and see if we need to make changes to our processes. Just as a reminder, we did create a scenario that helped us to build these draft action plans. And I think what's important here is to remember that we had sort of the X and Y axis, and that we looked at stock productivity and replacement and whether or not it's, on the high end, mostly maintaining, or are we on the low end, mostly declining, and then looking at the predictability of conditions and the ability of our science to assess those changes. And on one end, it's very unpredictable, and on the other end, it's not so predictable. Out of the several meetings that we had with the managers, including the summit, we just determined that there were 3 main issues that we wanted to look at when thinking about climate change. The first is cross-jurisdictional governance. We know that environmental changes are expected to continue to modify the distributions of our fish stocks A lot of species are expected to move north or south into deeper waters, maybe into shallower waters. Species may experience range expansions or range contractions. The changes will pose challenges for us, particularly in our governance structures and our arrangements, which were mostly established under single species management, and the assumption that stocks would remain unchanged. So the scenario planning process considered ways in which our governance structures and processes may need to be modified in order to address these changing distributions. And later today, I'll go over some potential actions of how we can address some of those changes. The other theme is managing under increased uncertainty. Environmental changes are leading to changes in our distribution and abundance of our resources. And these changes mean our historical conditions can no longer be used to predict the future, increasing our uncertainty around catch limits, management responses, different management decisions. So what kinds of actions can be taken to prepare for and respond to this increased uncertainty in our management? And then lastly, our data sources and partnerships. One of the primary axes used to develop the scenarios were based on the predictability of our ocean conditions, which includes how well science is able to assess and predict changes in stock production and distributions. And providing stock information and locations hinge on the ability to evaluate accurate and timely data. Coordination between all of the management entities on the East Coast, our federal partners, academic partners, fisheries stakeholders, and other ocean users will play a huge role in which side of the axis we will find ourselves in the future. So we held this summit meeting in February of 2023. The goal of this was to develop a set of potential governance and management actions resulting from this scenario-based exploration. It was sort of the end capstone of our process. We had over 50 managers representing all the councils and NOAA fisheries there, and we focused on those three themes that I went through. And there is a summit report that came out of this meeting. The summit report was in your meeting materials. It includes the overarching themes, how we designed the process, details of each of the discussions that the breakout groups had, and then sort of reflections and concluding thoughts. Those reflections and concluding thoughts and the information that was collected during the breakouts is what really helped the core team develop the potential draft action plan. So while a lot of those details are in extensive notes in the summit report, which I recognize is pretty long, it really helped the core team pull out tangible ideas for how we can potentially move forward. So the action menu, or potential action menu, is important to say. They're not decisions that have been made. As I said, expand on these ideas that we heard at the summit. We've grouped the actions by theme, and then the Northeast Regional Coordinating Council, with participation from the South Atlantic Council, helped the core team prioritize the potential actions, and then identify next steps of individuals or bodies that might work on these potential actions. We are hoping to use this as a planning tool guide to work collectively with our partners, or in some cases individually within the commission. It is our intent that this is a living document, so it will change over time based on recommendations from different management bodies or from the core team, which will be changing its name, and a leadership group coming out of the NRCC with additions from the South Atlantic region. The action menu has an introduction, high priority, medium priority, and parking lot. issues. It also identifies leadership and staff roles. And then at the very end, it has a list of all of the actions in the document, just a simple list. So from the review that we had with the NRCC and the South Atlantic Council, this group helped the core team provide input on the descriptions. Were they adequate and clear for common understanding of what we were trying to achieve for each action, whether it was a high, medium, or low priority, and then what we would do for the next steps to address that potential action, and where additional groundwork might be needed before considering the issue. It also formed 2 groups to continue work on this issue. We want to make sure that the volume of work that we've done on this action does not just stop here and lay dead in the water. So there have been 2 groups formed to keep us on our toes. First is the East Coast Climate Coordination Group. This is a leadership level group. This group will oversee the implementation of actions or what is being done through the management bodies, whether that be councils, commission, or NOAA. And it'll also ensure that actions are continually prioritized, either jointly or by the individual management bodies, and that we can find resources when needed to focus on the work and then execute the actions in a coordinated fashion. The Climate Innovation Group, which is what we formerly called the core team, will sort of help keep this leadership group informed. And they'll work to identify ideas that are worthy of consideration for this leadership group. It'll review changes to the factors that are shaping our East Coast fishery management, help identify potential actions from the broader list of summit suggestions, generate any new actions that need to be added to the list, and present updated actions to the Climate Coordination Group on an annual basis. And we anticipate that this group will probably utilize the ecosystem reports that the science centers provide to the councils on a regular basis to help us sort of formulate what new actions need to be added or if something should be shifted to a different priority, in particular as we see changes in our ecosystems. I recognize that the South Atlantic Council hasn't gotten one of these reports yet, but I know that the South Atlantic Science Center is working on these. And just quickly, this is sort of what the action plan looks like. It identifies the issue highlighted in green. It provides a description of what that issue is discussing. And then there's a bulleted list of potential actions. Next to that bulleted list is a potential group that could take on this action. And it also pulls out a list of barriers and considerations if an entity is going to take on the issue. Sometimes it has some long-term objectives as well. And so for sort of next steps here, we're sharing the summit report and the potential action menu, or we already have, with the participants that were on the webinars that we did, came to the different workshops that we did, the summit. We've put out press releases on this. We are working on finalizing a scenario planning toolkit. This is designed to be used by any East Coast stakeholder. It sort of summarizes the scenario work that we did and offers suggestions for how other groups can use the materials to have valuable conversations about climate change. We're including the presentations that we've done, draft agendas, scenario creation worksheets, and guidelines for how to use them. We're really hoping that that this might be used by coastal communities, academics, small groups, if they're thinking about climate change, to really have valuable and thoughtful conversations. All of the management bodies are getting a similar meeting that we are doing here today. And then we'll continue these meetings with the East Coast Climate Coordination Group and the Climate Innovation Group on an annual basis to keep pushing these actions forward. And then we'll have each of the management bodies consider what of the potential actions that they want to put into their work plans. And that is, the key reason why today I'm going to almost read to you all the list of actions that we have, in particular ones that I think are valuable for the commission to think about. As you know, we develop our action plan for review by this body at the annual meeting. So between now and the annual meeting, if there are ideas that you have that you think might be useful to put into our action plan next year related to climate, then please reach out to myself or Bob or a staff member on those ideas so that we can incorporate them into the action plan. So I'll stop here and see if anybody has any questions.
Any questions for Tony about what she's presented so far? I don't see any. All right.
All right. So this is the action menu, and I'm going to just scroll through it. And I'm just going to start with the high priority actions. This first action is a part of the cross-jurisdictional governance theme. So how do we change our management processes? And the first one is reevaluate council committee structure, use, and decision-making. And you think to yourself, Tony, this is not the council. We are not doing committees. But for the commission, we do have joint management species with the councils. And so I think it's important for us to think about how we work with council committees and what would it mean for the commission if councils were to reevaluate their committee structure and how they use it. The idea is to think about committee representation, what the roles are for the committees and their decision making, and how to move forward with more alignment of how each council utilizes their committees. Each council utilizes their committees in a slightly different way, so there's not consistency. And so in order to address this, it is being suggested that there is a leadership planning exercise to further explore these ideas, and it is suggested that the East Coast Climate Coordination Group be a part of that. Obviously, the commission is a part of this group. The next option or issue is to reevaluate and potentially revise the advisory panel representation. We recognize that climate change is going to change our species distributions, and there is potential concerns that our advisory panel membership may not be representative of species. In particular, in our management bodies, if a species is starting to move outside of a council jurisdiction, does their AP have individuals on it that are in that process or not? In some cases they do, in other cases they don't. But we have to sort of think about how ecological and social economic changes may need to drive changing needs for AP representation. It's suggested that staff in the different management entities coordinate and evaluate what we could do to the representation and appointment process for APs to address these issues. We also noted in the document that in general, a lot of the management bodies are struggling with AP participation in some species and engagement with those AP members. And so it's also something that we think we may want to think about in this process of is what's a better way we can get engagement while we go through these steps. Next is to develop joint management agreements with the aim of clarifying roles and increasing efficiency in our management processes. We have several species that are either jointly managed or cooperatively managed with the councils. In some cases, there are rules that we follow in how we conduct business with those management bodies. In some cases, those rules are written down somewhere. In other cases, they are not. We think it would be good to clearly define what those roles are, how the management bodies have to work together. It is a high priority for us to get these rules and roles written down with the Mid-Atlantic Council in particular, since those are species that we manage jointly. There is also a recommendation to evaluate and review agreements for other species as necessary, but that is a lower priority. And we are thinking this is related to either council to council plans or council and commission plans, but more the complementary ones versus the joint ones. And we suggested that that be done with the East Coast Climate Coordination Group. And I'm going to skip a couple that I don't think are quite as important for the commission. So under theme 2, managing, I'll pause there and see if anybody has any questions under the cross-jurisdictional or ideas for moving forward.
Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Tony. Could you just give maybe Tony a concrete example of what you'd mean, like to, even on the last one, developing joint management agreements with the aim of clarifying roles? You mentioned black sea bass, scup, and summer flounder. What would you see? What was the result, like a concrete action that would be taken?
Yes. So we have operating procedures for how the boards vote, how actions are taken, but those operating procedures aren't actually written down anywhere that staff can find. People say they are, but we've never been able to find them. So we think it would be important to actually have them written out and defined. How we've sort of come to some verbal agreements on how this policy board operates with the council when thinking about the harvest control rule, but those also are not, written out and resolved. And I think it just would be helpful for staff to have those roles laid out. We can share them with people when they ask questions about them. And it may be that you all think that process works great, but maybe there's some more efficiencies that we could add to them, have better transparency for the public or not. Okay, then moving on to managing under increased uncertainty. The first high priority issue for this is identify ecosystem level contextual information that can be considered within the management processes to help incorporate climate change information and decisions. So we know that changing climate can impact our fish stocks, our habitats, how these species interact with each other. Sometimes it is in logical ways, and sometimes it's in ways that surprise us. It's really important for us to consider holistically ecosystem level impacts when making management decisions. It can be quantitative, qualitative. We can do risk assessments in thinking about ecosystem approaches to fisheries management. So we know NOAA has been thinking about this. They have a technical memo that provides examples how ecosystem risk assessments have been used in the past in fisheries management. So we do have some work that has already been done. We have suggested that that memo be presented to councils and commissions.
This is really boring.
Really?
I don't even know how she can talk about it.
You got that, Tina? I thank you. And then another thing that has been requested or thought about being requested is that for the risk assessments that do get presented to the councils, they don't always include some of the state-only or commission-only managed fisheries, but those fisheries could have significant impacts on an ecosystem. So thinking about menhaden, perhaps as an example. So seeing if we can get some of those species added into those risk assessments And then those risk assessments also be presented to the commission. I know for some of you that would mean getting those assessments twice, as many of this group is our council members, but I think it would be helpful for us as well in moving forward with management decisions. This last one was about NEPA stuff and other federal measures. So then moving in, still in the high priority, but moving into data sources and partnerships. First is expanding the study fleet to include recreational fisheries, and then also ensuring that the data that are being compiled in the study fleet are actually used. The study fleet, for those that are not familiar with them, are partnerships between the science centers, management bodies, and industry stakeholders, where the science center will define a data need that could either be based on the assessments or management issues, and they work with industry to do different research projects to help address those research needs. Currently, there was only a small commercial fishery study fleet, but with just recently, GARFO has started a recreational study fleet project. I think budget money has been set aside to get this going. But so in addition to that project, looking at New England for hire groundfish fleet, we have identified having a group get together to look at where study fleet and projects can be utilized both by the councils and the commission to, one, access study fleet data, and then two, to develop a plan for tracking and communicating how that study fleet data has been used, and then finding better ways to incentivize industry to participate in these programs. On the medium priority for this is to help start developing sort of shovel-ready cooperative research projects that can be quickly initiated when different resources become available. This is identified for the science centers to do. And then lastly is to develop a plan to incorporate the recreational study fleet into the recreational estimates from the MRIP program. We put this in the parking lot just because we would need results from the study fleet first, and we know that that might take a little while. So it's not that it's not important, but we just knew the length of time would be there. So then moving next is using survey mitigation around offshore wind and transition to industry-based surveys or other survey platforms. And while almost every action here is identified for a science center, I know that these issues are quite important to the commission. And so I just wanted to quickly highlight that it is here as one of the action menu items. We know that offshore wind is going to present a challenge for assessing surveys and the use of our traditional survey methods and gear. This is just to identify that we need to redesign surveys and transition to some potential other platforms that can effectively move within the offshore wind areas. Next is improve the use of existing data. So we know that there is going to be the need for a lot of new and novel data collection ideas under increased uncertainty and climate change issues. But we also know that we have extensive data sets available to us now. And some of those data sets are known and others are not. And so this idea is just thinking about ways to better inform all of our partners of what data exists and how it can be accessed. And potentially how data collection activities can be expanded to better utilize it with the data sets that we are currently using now. So one idea to do this is hold meetings with the councils, the commissions, regional offices, and the science centers to discuss what are our existing data streams, what the historical data sets could be, how they could be utilized better to inform decision makings, assessments, and monitoring. and that this could be done either regionally or across the different management bodies. And then on a more local level, we could think about this once we have a compiled list of information, perhaps from the first meeting, is have PDTs and FMATs have similar types of meetings to identify immediate FMP needs for data, and then determine whether or not we have data sets that could be worked with those. I'm going to stop here. That is the end of our high priority issues.
Questions for Tony or comments about the ranking? Jason?
Tony, could you scroll back to the very first one there? I had a thought, but I need to see it again to remember my thought. Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I had like, my brain immediately went to like kind of a risk context. So I'll give you an example. And I guess I'm wondering if this is what, I think this thought is captured there, but I just want to confirm. So, you know, think of something like lobster. You have like a temperature index, and you're getting that from the EDAB group at NOAA. They're kind of putting together these really cool, you know, it's actually like a website now where you can kind of pull information in a customized way. And so you generate a temperature index for a relevant area, and you see that the temperature being above 20 degrees is like expanding, right? And that's kind of like a critical temperature for lobster. And so you could look at that information, then as a management body, you could say, okay, that should bump us into like a, you know, higher risk, or actually lower risk tolerance category. And so I'm imagining like developing sort of like grids or tables or something that looks like the harvest control rule setup to kind of understand. So you have this climate information, and you kind of think of it in your management decisions by way of, you know, risk. So is that kind of like the idea with some of these next steps, like something like that?
So, yeah, I think so. I think for this particular action item, I think they're thinking more holistically, like big, like regions in terms of risk assessments, but that's not to say that we couldn't do this here. There are two other potential actions that are identified. I think they're both in the medium priorities. One is about risk assessments, and the other is our management response. Lobster is used as one of the examples in terms of the trigger. So like somewhere one of those could fall into where we are for this. But I mean, I think, yes. I mean, in this third bullet here, where it says identify opportunities to use specific types of quantitative and qualitative ecosystem information to identify and avoid risks. You know, your example is very specific, but I don't know if that, you know, could be applied in a larger range way.
No, that I appreciate that. Right. It's very specific, and that's like, I'm always trying to sort of understand things in that way. Like, how would we actually do this thing like in real life? And I always have that problem. Like when we think about the regional level, like the first iterations of some of the ecosystem reports, they're at that regional level, and it's awesome information, and I just don't know what to do with it. So to kind of think about it in sort of like way in the weeds, all right, how can we take this one piece of information and apply it? So maybe that's my suggestion is, and I think this was also in there, but the climate innovation group, maybe that's how you kind of work, is to just really illustrate some very concrete examples of, you know, how these things kind of become an actual next step.
And I think that Sean Lucy, who is one of the members of the core team, who works at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in their ecosystem branch, and Sean does part of the risk assessments for the New England Council, or well, in the New England area. And he and I can sit down and chat about sort of taking your thoughts, how they may apply in a regional level, or is it that something in the ecosystem report highlights that maybe there should be some warning signs that would direct you to think more specifically for a species or not, to pay more attention to it because of something that might be happening based on the environment itself, perhaps.
Any other questions, comments?
Okay, we're into our medium priority actions. So the NRCC leadership group identified these following potential actions as medium priority. They're important, but they're not necessarily suitable for near-term actions as those that were on the high priority list. We called it a watch list because the coordination and innovation group is on an annual basis going to continually track environmental and fishery conditions and other resources that we have available to us to see if things have changed in a way that would increase the priority level of this, or it may just be in some cases that the leadership group knew that their resources themselves couldn't address these issues right away, and it needed to be further down the line, whether that be funding resources or staff resources. So then for this first one is just to evaluate the mechanisms for the cross-pollination of SSCs. And you think to yourself, Tony, we don't have SSCs. Why is it circled? And as I believe it was Jason pointed out at the summit meeting, that while the commission doesn't have SSCs, we do have scientific bodies that act similarly to SSCs. And so getting those individuals together with the council SSCs would be beneficial for both bodies. But in particular, we know that for species that are jointly managed or experiencing distributional shifts that are close to the boundary edges, SSCs will be providing advice to their councils, and in some cases, due to how the management operations go, one SSC may be providing advice to one council on that particular species, and the other SSC might be providing slightly different advice to the other council on that same species. And so I just think it would be good to continue to make sure that the bodies are having meetings together to continue to discuss how they're talking through the issues. In some cases, maybe having a liaison from one of the SSCs to the other. In some cases, that does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't. It never happens, but just having some consistency on how that would work, and that the commission would be a part of workshops that had the SSCs get together, identifying ways we can improve coordination and sharing knowledge with each other. And then also to just consider adding topics for discussions at the SSC coordination subcommittee meetings. And I believe that is the meeting where all of the SSCs in the United States get together and address issues. Next is managing under uncertainty under the medium priorities. And this is to improve the use of risk policies to better account for current and future climate impacts. Each of our management bodies has a risk policy. We are working on our risk policy. And these policies identify the bounds of how risk tolerant a management body wants to be. Oftentimes these policies inform and work in conjunction with harvest control rules set by the managing body. And so some of the risk policies may be based on assumptions of stationarity, and that participants discussed how these policies may need to be reassessed to include challenges related to changing climate and non-stationarity in marine populations and ecosystems. We know things are moving. So one of the things we identified is to have a review of all the risk policies and then include the commission's risk policy in this review. The New England Council has already done a review of all of the US Council risk policies. Once the commission's policy has been adopted, we would add that to that, and then develop a staff working group to discuss the pros and cons of the different approaches for accounting for climate change within a risk policy, and then how you might make changes to those risk policies for the different management entities. The climate coordination group could evaluate the need to consider climate in the risk policy itself for that management body and make recommendations. And then we could also identify steps that the management bodies can take to make risk policies more reflective of climate challenges. That's for all of the management bodies to do. And then also work to ensure that our risk policies consider and clearly communicate the uncertainty within those policies, and make sure we understand that when we're making and changing our management policies themselves. And just to put out there that I know our risk policy does take into consideration some environmental issues. Whether or not it goes far enough or not, it will be something that we can evaluate over time. Next is to identify and establish best practices for increasing nimbleness and responsiveness in our management decisions. So, where we know we have changing conditions and we think our management of that particular species is somewhat volatile because of those changing conditions, we may want to have new management frameworks that are nimble, adaptable, and robust to these expected changes. I think this is something that is continuously coming up in our management boards. And in some cases, we have started to identify ways to respond. An example for the commission is the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank lobster gauge size change that was approved in May. It is an immediate change in the size. When a trigger is hit, we don't have to do a management document, and the states put that measure right in place. There are examples here in the document of other management bodies that have made these types of nimble changes. But I think it's just important that we continue to think about this as we develop our management programs. Next is to create a more adaptable structure for fishing permits. I'm not going to get into this too much because our commission plans don't really get into fishing permits too much, but I know the states do have permits within your own systems. And something that we hear about all the time from our stakeholders is how complex and encompassing that the permit process can be and needing process in federal and state waters. And so it just may be helpful to think about these systems and as species move along the coast to make it easier for the stakeholders to perhaps gain access and that make that permitting process easier. So switching themes, the data sources and partnerships, standardized data collection to break down geographic barriers along the East Coast. That's both in state and federal waters. Having standardized surveys and other data collection and storage methods across our regions would allow data to be more easily transferable and usable. It's particularly important when considering survey change limitations arising from some external factors like wind development. It's the foundation of our management process, and it's so important for us to be able to access our information and continue our surveys. So one suggestion is to develop a national survey program. Another would be to have the Northeast and the Southeast Science Centers develop strategies for combining survey methodologies. Could be standardizing gear, or it could be a modeling framework to merge different survey technologies. We can look at prioritizing and develop data standards so that data can be readily used in various modeling frameworks that combine data across regions. And we could also look at standardizing data management and storage so that the data is readily accessible to all that need it. Next is to focus on new technologies development to more rapidly gather data into assessments. Most of these are for the science centers, but I just wanted to point it out that it's, you know, something that we did think about. We know that there is so much really cool technologies that can help us gather information, and we should really be starting to pay better attention to what those developments are and try to funnel funds into being able to utilize those technologies. All right, so I'm going to stop here and see if there's any questions.
Questions or comments? Go ahead, Justin.
Thanks, Bud. So one impression I'm getting so far is that it seems like an underlying assumption here is that we kind of have all the data we need to do the science and the assessments we need to kind of support the work being contemplated here. So I think, you know, we've seen things about making better use of existing data, standardizing data collection, you know, maybe using new technology to collect information. But getting back to that theme we were talking about this morning and at the NOAA State Directors meeting, you know, I wonder whether, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but if there should be a focus on identifying the information we don't have or that we think we're going to need to do this sort of more responsive management or to address climate change. I'm just thinking about something Jason brought up. Can't remember when, it was earlier this week, about, you know, the value of gut content data. You know, a lot of doing ecosystem management is about knowing who's eating who, when and where. And I don't think we have enough of that information sort of on the Atlantic coast. So I don't know, maybe I'm sort of jumping the gun, this is coming later, but it just seemed like that's my general impression so far, is there's a lot of focus on, you know, what we would do with the information we have, but not on what information we don't have that we need.
You want to respond to that? Let me go to Jason.
I'm trying to remember if we had that in the parking lot, so give me a second.
Thanks. Actually, in response to Justin, I agree with you, Justin. Maybe I'll start with the gut content information. That's like one of the, I think it was the second to last one of those that Tony just went through. I think there is a lot of information out there. It's just that it's like easiest to use the science center's data and harder to, once you like try and get beyond that, because it's like Mystic Aquarium has like gut content from seals, but God only knows like what kind of, you know, shape that data is in. And so that, you know, I think the idea of using innovative approaches to start to capture some of this, or standardizing data formats, you know, I think that's kind of splitting what you just said, where the data is there, but we're not using it. So we need to find ways to be able to use what's there. And then the exception to what you talked about is some of the study fleet ideas. And so I think the point behind that is doing exactly what you're talking about. Like, there's all of these people that go out on the water every day. Is there a way to like grab information from them and in a way that we can use it for different things? And so that would be a new source of data that would capture different new things. And so it was exciting to see those elements in here. I was glad to hear, in particular, I think the recreational study fleet concept, that I remember talking about that at the summit. Others did as well. And that's one that I think is really exciting because we could never, as state agencies, government agencies, we could never create that level of power, sampling power. So finding ways to tap into what is out there, I think that is a new data source to look into.
So for both of responses to both these, so up on the screen, Justin, this is in the low priority, or well, it's the low priority list. And one of the actions, so it's develop a process between management and science organizations to prioritize data needs for climate ready management. A priority is the human dimensions data for identifying training opportunities for managers to help better consider human dimensions when making decisions. And but there's also to hold a workshop to determine what are our data needs across the regions to inform decisions on climate ready science. So I apologize. I do not remember why we just put this in the, why, I shouldn't say we, I didn't do it. Put this in the low priority set. I don't know if Spud or Bob or Joe remember. But if I can come up with it, I'll let you know later. And then also,
Kirby, come on up to the microphone.
Thank you, Chair Spud. So just a note, I know USGS falls outside of your groups of potential action work, but within the Department of Interior, USGS is the sole science agency, and we have within the Northeast region climate adaptation science centers that are funding and pursuing work specifically on climate change. And so I encourage you, as you all see best and needed, that we can continue to provide information on where there are both funding and projects that are of relevance to this board. There is a certain level of bridging a terrestrial to marine gap that we have in some parts of our portfolio, but I will note that we have within the Eastern Ecological Science Center a focus on developing techniques around artificial intelligence and machine learning, in particular, using citizen science information to identify the spread of disease in certain fish species, such as freshwater basses, as well as in evaluating the flow change of streams throughout parts of the Northeast. So those are just some notes to keep in mind as you guys continue to evaluate the expertise, the data needs you have in this challenging world. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kirby.
and then second to Jason's point about other, I think, data sources, also in the low priority under data sources and partnerships is to develop incentives for better reporting to help reduce uncertainty. And falling within that is looking at developing better tools to utilize citizen science. And, we think that that can be done by all of the entities. Develop a report that identifies the weaknesses in fishery dependent reporting requirements. That's identified for the science centers. And to develop a plan to monitor and enforce compliance to reporting requirements, something that, law enforcement and commission and councils could do as well. So those issues are here just in the lower priority, whether that has to do with funding or just staff capacity to get to those issues. Okay. Again, so these are the parking lot or low priority. It's the intention to hold these ideas. In some cases, these ideas were infeasible to meaningfully address at this time. They're either in conflict with other approaches that we have to management or conflict with things that had a higher priority to the group. In some cases, they are things that are not viable within the current fisheries laws. And so some on the leadership group felt that they should be moved into the parking lot. The first, let's see, couple look at cross-jurisdictional governance. And, you know, one of the main issues that brought on this discussion, you know, is thinking about species and how they're moving up and down the coast and how we can address the management of, in particular, species that have allocations. I think that, you know, the black sea bass, summer flounder discussions probably were the initial thoughts to this group being formed like way back in the day. And so some ideas that came out of the summit meeting thought a little bit more holistically about how to address these issues, but these were pretty sparked a little bit of concern for some entities in thinking about reevaluating holistically the council structure. In many cases, some of these things would require changes to the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and you know, we haven't seen any changes to the Magnuson-Stevens Act in quite some time. So the idea that some of these would move very quickly is probably not going to happen. But just to, you know, point out that there were ideas about reevaluating council committee structure so that the committees had decision-making authority. There were ideas of having coast-wide councils with varying voting representations by FMPs. So instead of having 3 councils, have 1. It allows for those states that the thought would be to allow for those states that are not on that management council to still have voting representation when issues came up for species that are outside, normally would be outside of a council's jurisdiction, to have a vote or have more of a say in the decisions that are made for that management species. But again, that would require a change in Magnuson. There was also an idea to address this issue by changing state representation on councils. This too would require a change in the Magnuson Act. There was also the idea to clarify and potentially expand the roles of the liaisons between councils. How those are used can be done a little bit differently. But if you change the role of a liaison to give them voting rights, in some cases that also could require changes in Magnuson. Not all of the changes for the council liaison roles would require Magnuson, but at this time it wasn't something that the group thought should be a high priority. Then under the managing under increased uncertainty, thinking about including spatial ideas in management, specifically in relation to the leading and trailing edges of our shifting stocks. When we see that climate change is influencing the distribution of the stock, either in the north or southern direction or the east to the west, there may be advantages to managing the leading and the trailing edge of that stock differently than the core area. If you have genetic diversity that's high at one of the edges, maybe more conservative management is more appropriate for that species. And you know, some stock assessments are starting to think about how shifts are impacting the populations, and thinking in particular about the transboundary resource stock assessments that occur. And some actions for this are creating a working group to explore this issue. This could be with the Climate Innovation Group. We could try to compile examples where spatial considerations have been used in management decisions, and then also think about ways to measure stock shifts and how to identify what should be considered leading trailing edges. Also think about recommending East Coast councils consider if spatial management is appropriate for any of their currently managed stocks or not. Then another one is to consider alternative management options instead of or in addition to using stock assessments that directly incorporate environmental or ecosystem parameters in the assessment. We know that our changing ocean conditions mean that the underlying assumptions common to our stock assessment models may no longer be valid. It'll make identifying appropriate catch limits even more challenging than it is now. And so given that, that these conditions can impact aspects of the fish stock, may be impossible to incorporate all the important sources of uncertainty into the stock assessment models and results. Therefore, in addition of incorporating climate indicators directly into traditional stock assessments may become more important, and considering these alternative approaches to incorporating climate uncertainties into our management processes. Alternative approaches also could be useful for other fisheries, and therefore we would need a triage of which species to be most beneficial from these alternative approaches instead of trying to tackle them all at one time. I think that at the commission, we're already starting to think about this in some of our species. But the Climate Innovation Group could look for case studies for robust management options. So looking at indicator-based management, bluefin tuna has an example, or harvest control rules, or dynamic reference points. We also could look at case studies where management strategy evaluation was actually useful in supporting a decision tool. And then also using the CVA results to identify East Coast species that are particularly vulnerable to climate change and consider developing new approaches for those species. And this is already happening both at the Mid-Atlantic and New England in some cases. Lastly, I think this is the last one because I've already gone over the others, but to better incorporate qualitative information, including local ecological knowledge and community vulnerability assessments to improve management in changing climate. We know that quantitative data analysis for all species is not going to necessarily be feasible. So trying to identify options for incorporating qualitative information on how the ecosystem is changing our fisheries and how those fisheries are reacting to the changes may be necessary. There are some examples to build on. We can use those to better understand how they work. So the summit participants had expressed interest in ways to incorporate local and ecological knowledge into our process. So we have some potential actions that could help us do this, both either having an inventory of where and how qualitative information has been used in our process, and then improving the use of the CVA assessments. And those are the community vulnerability assessments. And then considering expanding the state of the ecosystem reports and the ecosystem status reports. And I think I've gone over these other ones. Oh, no, not this one. This one here is to modernize the data management to facilitate better sharing of data and prepare for an influx of new data streams and fostering new partnerships. So other uses of the ocean are rapidly expanding, and dealing with all of these various sectors and entities is super challenging for the states, for NOAA, for the councils. So, but we could try to think about these as opportunities to foster new partnerships and how we can utilize data and information from each other. I know that at times that can seem challenging, in particular with wind issues that we've been going through, but there could be potential actions to help us better utilize those partnerships. And that, I think, is everything. Yep. I'll take any questions. And, I will say this, just because the NRCC leadership group identified something as low priority, in particular in this data collection, science, or managing uncertainties sections, doesn't necessarily mean that you all agree with where some of those ideas were put. And if it's something that we as a commission want to work on and have resources for, we can identify those and put them into our action plan. The governance issues are a little bit trickier because some of those do, require changes to Magnuson or working with our partners and who we manage with. So I'll leave it at that.
All right, questions for Tony, comments? Yeah, Brian?
Thank you, Tony. That was excellent. I was curious to know, I really enjoyed the summit. I thought it was a great exercise and there was a real feeling of urgency brought to the subject. Had there been any follow-up discussion about continuing that joint summit of bringing the groups together there's a multitude of subjects and it goes on and on. But I hadn't heard coming out of that whether if it was cost prohibitive, if it was meaningful enough to try to do it again.
That has not come up before. I will say that. I don't know. I think if it's something that we want to do in the future, I think, the management bodies could discuss it and find funding to put together. Whether or not it's something that needs to happen every year, probably not, but it could be something that this leadership group could consider for, every 3, 4, 5 years. I don't know what the right time frame would be. Or we could have, some virtual updates, whether or not those same individuals every single time, or whether or not we need to change up the list some of who gets to attend.
All right, any other questions or comments? John Clark?
Thank you, Spud. Thank you, Tony. This is quite a big undertaking here. A lot of this seems like it's like almost an agglomeration of a lot of ideas I've been hearing over the years, at these meetings and other meetings and all. And, a lot of the same problems seem to be coming up, such as, getting anything done with MSA. Do you see having climate change out there as perhaps prodding action on some of these things that hasn't happened yet, or just another thanks for the suggestion type of response for these things?
I'm hoping that these are prodding things that push us into action. Do we need to address every single one of these actions? No, that's not possible. I know it's not. Staff, we don't have the resources, funding, people to do it. But, there are a lot of important ideas here, whether it is in supporting our science, that support our management processes, that we can't turn a blind eye to. And we need to, even if it is slowly, start to tick things off the list in order to be able to be nimble and responsive into the future. I think if we just sit and don't make any changes now, we are going to be in a whole lot of trouble into the future. So I recognize that this list is extensive and maybe overwhelming, but I also thought it was super important to spend some time actually looking at this list so that we can start ticking it off.
I was just going to say that nimble and responsive are typically not adjectives we use with this management process.
But I want it to be.
Yeah, I think that the thing we're all dealing with is when you're busy fighting fires, it's hard to do fire prevention, and that seems like that's the world we live in now, is we spend all our time fighting fires when we know we need to be preventing as many as we can. But you gotta start somewhere. So I guess, time will tell whether this is fruitful or not. So, Joe?
Thanks, but I just want to follow up on that one because I think that's one of the most interesting and important ones that we can contribute to. And it's a matter of planning. So it's not that the work doesn't go into and the time go into what are the management actions. It's just when do you do that, right? So you build these triggers, you take the time when the time is there and say when things go wrong and we hit this trigger, instead of then starting an amendment process, we're ready to go. I think it's one of the, really, to me, one of the most intriguing things that has come out of this.
That's interesting, Joe. Could you just like maybe give a little more concrete example of how you see that working on one of the species that we work with?
Well, I think you have examples, correct, Tony, on trigger. So it was just done with lobster, and I think there were other examples in other regions too.
I think one of them was what we do in the South Atlantic with shrimp. We hit temperature triggers and we can expect there to be a kill of shrimp inside. So we shut down the offshore waters to protect, any of the out migrating overwintering shrimp that are going to be the brood stock for the next crop. So that's a very simple thing with a very annual crop animal. It gets more complex, when you have these more sophisticated life cycles, but it is one that has proven to work and, has generally been supported by the people who are affected by it because they realize that, if you don't protect your overwintering brood stock, you're not likely to have a good opportunity the next year.
So you've done something where you've sort of jump-started the process by having this trigger, as you're calling it here.
Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if you'll indulge me, I'll make a couple of comments and then I'll have a suggestion at the end, I promise. So, just a comment on the report. Generally, I think it was put together really well. It generally reflects like what I remember from the summit and from the, some of the background work that went into it. So I was pretty happy to see a lot of the things that I remember from my breakout groups ended up in the report with some level of detail. So I really appreciated that. I'll offer a respectful critique because again, I know this is an enormous amount of work for the folks that were kind of putting all of this stuff together. It's still kind of high level. Like I was anticipating like a little bit more, I don't know. I was expecting it to be, down a level, like, okay, this is the thing that we're going to, do. I think it's challenging because you're talking about regional councils and a commission. And so I get that part of it, but that's like one critique that I have. And in particular, I felt that way in the governance part of it. And maybe that's not shocking to anyone that I would say that, but I remember the discussion being more diverse and more directed. And what ended up in here was I remember the committee discussion, but it was, in my view, was a smaller part of the discussion, but it is obviously the easiest thing that we think we could probably do. However, I can be open-minded. And so if there is a way that some of that governance stuff, like I think about it with our jointly managed species, right? And so could we construct a situation like when we go into fluke scup black sea bass commission has a vote, and then the Mid-Atlantic has a vote, and they both have to kind of pass to get to the next level. Is that one of the efficiencies? Can we just all vote at once instead of in a sequential manner? Does that need a redo of Magnuson and all that sort of stuff? So now to my suggestion, and it's relevant. So I wonder if we as a group, the commission, can kind of go through the report and pick like one or two things from each of the sections. And for the commission, say, okay, these are the things that we're going to put a little more specificity to and bring back forward as kind of action items. And I think that might be a tractable way to take some of the stuff and actually, you know, try and make it have some real world impact, which I think is what people want from this report. And we can keep it, you know, I don't know how we pick the one or two, we vote or something, I don't know, but have some sort of mechanism to come back to this, pick one or two things from each of the sections, and as a group kind of put together what we think that one or two things actually looks like, you know, in our processes and data collection systems and what have you. So in any case, you know, I thought this was great. It was fun to be a part of. I agree. I really like the idea about follow-up summit. So if you think about, we constructed this from whole cloth. If we did it again, now we have some focus. And so maybe, you know, that might be valuable. And yeah, the frequency, I don't know. Getting that big group together, probably can't do that every year, maybe every other year or something like that. But I think that's a great idea. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason. I think everybody's trying to figure out, well, what do you do with this thing that you've now created? I mean, we find ourselves in a similar situation every time we do a strategic plan update. It's like, okay, so how do we translate this into something that's actionable, where we can show that this actually produced a favorable outcome? And you know, probably your suggestion is as realistic as anything, because you know, we can either be a passenger on the bus, or we can try to put our hands on the steering wheel and help guide where the bus is going. And I think that's, you know, up to us as to how we want to do that. I mean, we're all busy. We always have lots to do when we come to these meetings, but you know, if we want this investment to pay off, I think we're going to have to nurture it as much as we can. So it's probably something we need to put thought into. How do we maintain our involvement as a commission to see that this is fruitful? And realizing that a lot of it is, you know, federal management oriented, but we, you know, as I frequently tell folks in NOAA fisheries, nobody lives in the EEZ. They live in our states. So, so we've got to tend to this. So I think anything we can do to keep our engagement in this and help drive the bus is going to be beneficial. So.
Just a couple of things, keeping on the thought process we are. I mean, personally, Jason, I love the thought of, you know, prioritizing a couple a year or whatever it may be in order to keep us ticking things off the list, and actually responding to some of these actions is great. Maybe we can challenge the other management entities to do the same. I invested a lot of my time in this, and so I want to see us to move forward, you know, not only because I invested my time, but just for the betterment of our management process and, you know, to transparency through climate change and how we respond. And then separate to very respectful critique, and no offense taken. I think the governance section was very difficult for the core team to kind of tackle. There were, I'll say, some conflicting concepts and ideas. There is a bit of a challenge in how we could write things up because of the Magnuson aspects to things and what councils and NOAA are allowed or not allowed to say in respect to how, when something requires a change to Magnuson. We do not, you know, we can freely discuss that here. We have no restrictions, but the councils do. And so, you know, we have to work in the constraints of all of our partners in putting this together. But I think that in this sort of white paper to work on our processes with the councils of how we do our business, that idea may be able to work. I don't know if you can all vote at once or not, if that's a conflict with Magnuson or not. We'd have to check. But I think those types of ideas could come up if we actually tackle that action.
Yeah, as we well know, voting procedures are a touchy subject these days, so lots of different ways. But okay, Eric, I'll call on you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And honestly, this effort was a great effort, a tremendous amount of work over a long period of time, a lot of public, transparent meetings. But there's this other thing going on, and I'm not sure if it's a parallel universe or not. I think it was touched on at the directors meeting on Monday, but has there been any further discussion about what 304F is going to do to this particular effort, or how the two might complement each other?
So, Eric, the core team has not discussed that. We do have a meeting coming up, which the date escapes me right now, but it's something that I could bring up. As you know, the leadership group will meet again in November prior to the NRCC meeting. I'm assuming there'll be some discussions about that when that occurs, but we have not had any formal discussions about it with NOAA, or if NOAA has thoughts on how that policy development interplays with some of the recommendations that are here in the potential action menu or not.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kearns. I appreciate that, but I think the timeline for moving ahead on 304F is pretty aggressive. I mean, I apologize for not being in the room to have this discussion, but I don't know if anybody from the service could tell us what their timeline is as far as their action goes.
I think Ruscio might be online. Hold on. Oh, he's in the back. Sorry, Mike. I thought you had told me you were going to be online. And Mike, do you mind saying what 304F is?
Sure. Good afternoon, Mike Ruccio with NOAA Fisheries. 304F is an existing provision within the Magnuson-Stevens Act that gives the Secretary of Commerce the authority to make decisions on shared jurisdiction regarding council governance. So it's been in the Act forever, since its inception. And it's basically the way that the Secretary can or might intervene in areas where there's a shared stock. We use 304F in an example that many people in the room might be familiar with when the blue line tilefish fishery started to develop in the Mid-Atlantic. Shared jurisdiction between South Atlantic Council, Mid-Atlantic Council, 304F was one of the things that we kind of went through the deliberative process in trying to decide, should councils manage this stock, this emerging fishery jointly? Should one council take lead? All those different kind of iterations that we have when we have shared jurisdiction. The project that's being referred to regarding 304F is to develop a procedural directive that sets forth, if you actually read 304F, there's not a lot of meat on there, right? So as is the case with many of these things, we try to develop some background guidance, and it's our intent to try to develop a document that explains, particularly as we know stocks may continue to shift and change, how would we go about that evaluation? What would the Secretary's criteria be? So it's available. I'm actually reviewing a letter right now to the Mid-Atlantic Council that's asking us to make that more publicly and widely available. One of the things that is, I think, germane to the conversation here is we were asked when we initially scoped this project. We started, I think it was in the May CCC meeting in 2022. Because this scenario planning project was ongoing, we were asked to kind of stand down and let the scenario planning effort do its work, conclude, see what, if anything, they came up with in terms of governance. And then instead of having a parallel development where one might be different than the other, see what the results of the scenario planning efforts were. So that's where we find ourselves now. Obviously, the scenario planning effort is not something that is just done and put to bed. Work continues. We're talking about that here today. However, we wanted that final report to be out. So we've kind of taken a look at that. We're trying to tease apart, what the recommendations are on climate governance, how those do or can mesh with what we've been thinking for 304F. I'm working on a response to the Mid-Atlantic Council, who's asked us, as I mentioned, to make this more publicly available and to have some public webinars and outreach on the 304F policy. So there'll be an update for that next week, potentially at the Mid-Atlantic Council. Eric, I was trying to look when I heard you come on the mic to figure out what our schedule was. I also recall it was fairly aggressive, but I don't know when we were supposed to conclude. And I also don't know at this point how this request for additional public engagement really changes that time frame. My assumption is it probably extends it some, but to what extent, I'm not sure. So I can go back and try to get that as a get back for the definitive time frame we had, but acknowledging it's probably changed a little bit just given kind of the request that we've had in the interim. So happy to answer any other questions you have on the 304F stuff. Thanks.
Go ahead, John.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Eric, and then I'll go to you, John.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to put Mr. Ruccio on the spot, and Mike, I appreciate your answer. That's a great answer. It would be great if everything would come together, and there's been a lot of effort on your part and on our part as well. So I think there's enough momentum between the two actions to make something that is really a valuable tool for all of us. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Eric. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And this question's from Mike, and you might want to just say that you delay your response until you're prepared to speak in front of the councils. But I'm just wondering what the management decision options are under 304F. So, for example, is there something other than complete joint decision making, involving both the Mid and New England on black sea bass, for example, if we were to go that way, or are there other like intermediate steps? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question through the chair. There were a number of different scenarios that were contemplated in the draft that we provided to the CCC, ranging from changing jurisdiction or the governance structure. So, if you took black sea bass, and I'm in no way, shape, or form saying this is what's going to happen, because there's full recognition that if everything moves north and east, you can't give them all to New England, right? So there has to be other functions, but that is one potential outcome. And we tried to develop some criteria that would help inform that decision making. If the majority of the stock has moved and is no longer in the governance footprint of one of the councils, how would you make that decision? And not only how would you make that decision, what data-driven metrics would you use to evaluate that? What would that process look like? So there's some information in that as well. The draft also contemplated shared governance that we have now, with some, I guess, kind of tweaks and changes that were conceptualized, having a council be in the lead, which we do for some of these stocks now. Monkfish is a really good example, where one council is in the lead, but there are two councils that are involved with the decision making and voting on that. But into the minutia of some of the things that were discussed here in climate governance in terms of sequencing of voting or how voting happens, we're still constrained by how Magnuson is set up. So as Tony mentioned, bringing somebody that's a proxy in and having them vote, we have to evaluate whether or not that's something that we can do given just who's represented on the councils in statute. So trying to remember off the top of my head if there's a few other ones, but most of them were not largely conceptual, vastly different from the things that we have now. It's more around how would we make decisions or evaluate if there's a need of a change, and a lot of that back end process. What's the time frame? What do you do if you are changing governance with a stock that's in poor condition and there's rebuilding requirements, which have timing metrics under Magnuson? Just how would you go about that transition?
All right, any other questions for Mike on that topic? All right, thanks, Mike, for the info. We appreciate it.
Sure, I'll be around if you have more. Thanks.
Get any more? All right, Tony's wrapped up what she was going to present to us. We've got just a very few minutes, so Are there any questions, comments that we want to wrap up with before we adjourn? Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, thanks. You know, a lot of people have said it. I think the list can be overwhelming. It's a lot of great work and all those other accolades. But, you know, I think any project like this, and Jason and I have talked about this, is you're not going to be able to pick up this whole package and implement it right away. You know, it's a piecemeal thing, and it may not even be implementing any one whole piece that's recommended here. So I think as the commission goes into its action planning process, and actually we have to do a new strategic plan for next year, you know, weaving in some of these concepts and the higher priorities, you know, I think is a step in the right direction. It's not going to be all these, but, you know, 2 or 3 of them, whatever it might be, and we can put that in the action plan, set some resources aside, set some either policy board or executive committee or whatever the right group is, or management science committee, whatever, some of their time aside to work on it over the next year, I think would be, you know, moving us in the right direction. So I think it's, you know, sort of between the summer meeting and the October meeting when we do our action plan for 24, if folks can spend time digesting this and picking their pet projects out of there, and you know, we can start working on those and weave them into the action plan.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I think the worst thing that could happen is to do nothing. You know, that just leaves everybody with a bad impression of, and consider how much effort went into this. So, but it's, yeah, I mean, the core team would probably just go off somewhere and we'd never see them again after all they put into this. So in the interest of their welfare, we need to find something that we can do to actually prove that this was worth all of the sweat, equity, and all that went into it. So with that, you want to do a wrap up comment or two?
I think Bob covered what I wanted to say, so I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Good discussion. Again, as Bob said, there's a lot of food for thought here, so keep thinking about it. And as we move into a strategic planning and action plan development, let's be thinking about, can we do something that shows all those who invested time and effort, as well as the public who is watching this, that this was a meaningful endeavor. So any opposition to adjournment? Seeing none, we stand adjourned.